How is everyone? Pray you're all doing well. Pray you're all growing. Getting ready for this coming conflagration just around the corner. We're watching the underpinnings being created around us, but we're all still struggling through, and I do pray for all of your growth. About 6 months ago, I came upon some sheep, various breeds. I first started with some American black bellies. I then grabbed a hold of three what are called Dorpers. A little bit of royal white mixed in, but generally speaking, they're Dorper in their overall expression. And then shortly after that, I was gifted 5 Icelandic sheep, which are actual wool sheep. The previous breeds were all hair sheep. They do really well in this area. They're not quite as big as the wool sheep, but they're a lot more hardy. It took a while for me to fully understand, I guess, the Spirit speaking to me about this situation. But it's really, now that I've had about 6 months under my belt of experience in taking care of these animals and coming to understand the ways in which they adapt to whatever experience they're in, their pen, their food, the person's raising them, or person in my case, because I'm really the only one that, I'm the most hands-on with them. I do have a little bit of help, but generally speaking, I guess I would be the shepherd. When I got a hold of the majority of these, all the females anyway, at least most of the females were pregnant. They were anywhere from 2 to 5 months away from giving birth. So I've had a lot of experience in trying to figure out just what it is they eat, how they react to proper shepherd, if you will, how their living situation can affect their behavior. And I have, even in this short period of time, come to really understand a lot of what the Bible is saying regarding all the different parables and all the different comparisons of Christians as being sheep-like in their reaction to both their teachers, their feed, their everyday experiences, the fact that they require a certain amount of gentle approach, and yet at times, not that you want to be overtly violent, and then of course when you harvest them there is a certain level of violence that's involved, but there's always a humane way to go about that. But it's quite amazing because all animals have a certain amount of adaptation and experiential memory that they build up to those who take care of them. But sheep in particular really do express a broad set of characteristics that directly apply to Christians. In John 21, I think verse 15 and on, we see Peter being reinstated by the Lord after his threefold rejection of him before the people and before the Sanhedrin and so on the night that he was crucified. The end result was Christ basically inquired of Peter 3 times that whether he loved him or not, and of course his answer was yes. And then the Lord's direct his direct answer to Peter saying, "Of course I love you," was a challenge for him to basically show his love or prove his love by feeding his sheep. Now, if you know anything about sheep, and you'll probably Google this afterward, you know that they have a certain subset of foods that are considered to be appropriate for certain stages of life. Obviously, when they're lambs, they need milk. There's about a 30 to 40 day period where that's about all they eat. They'll start chewing on grasses and legumes and so on intermittently so as to create what's called their rumen, their ability to digest roughage. But the reality is that first month and a half, they need sweet, supple, highly caloric milk so as to be able to not only give them the vitamins and minerals that they need, but also to establish that first stage of life and get them ready for the not so palatable, not so delicious, but overall mature food, if you will, that comes growing up off the ground in the form of grasses, different weeds, and different various plants that usually grow in most areas and most plains that are open and have a lot of open ground to be seeded. So when I got a hold of a good portion of these sheep, not all of them, the first bit, they're American black bellies. They're much more hardy and they'll eat just about anything. They're much more resistant to parasites. They're skittish and they're very difficult to wrangle, but they're kind of a set it and forget it type of sheep. The Dorpers, they're kind of a mix between the Icelandics and the black bellies, whereas in general they'll eat more than your typical wool sheep will, the Icelandics that I have, but they are more sensitive to nutrient deficiencies, and they're a little bit more emotional, but they're also more responsive to human interaction. They tend to eat out of your hand more, and they're just a little bit easier to deal with, and they're slightly larger, so they yield more. The Icelandic sheep, however, these were gifted, by the way, by a believer. Thank you very much, Jill, for doing that. It's been wonderful and an awesome experience. Very different. They're an extremely social animal. They will come up to me mostly. There's one that's kind of antisocial, if you will. By and large, they are very vocal and very personable, and though they do tend to run when you go in the pen because they're worried about what may occur shortly afterwards, because sheep have a tendency of being skittish when the boss comes around, when the shepherd shows up. They all are, really. These are the ones that are less likely to run. They're more likely to behave and go about their normal business without being too bothered. My initial experience with all of these was that they all had slightly different desires in what they like to eat. Obviously, all the lambs need milk. All the ewes need a decent amount of calories, especially when they're pregnant, specifically so that they can grow the baby within them. The rams are pushy, bossy, and will eat just about anything. Little known, or actually no, it's actually very well known if you do even a little bit of study. Foods like grains and alfalfa especially, they tend to be very high in calories. They also tend to be very high in mineral content, especially calcium. And it turns out if you feed sheep, especially full-grown mature sheep that are not pregnant, too much alfalfa, eventually their bodies will retain a bunch of calcium. It'll build up in their digestive systems and in their urinary tract, and eventually create a bunch of stones. They'll start having water retention. It'll affect their growth, their attitudes, their ability to process food in general. So it's kind of a bad scene if you get them exposed to too much food. The same thing kind of goes for grains, in that a little bit is okay, especially when they're little or when they're pregnant or about to ovulate. But too many calories in general will destroy their bacterial content within their stomachs, I should say. It affects their excretions. It affects their sheep can become diabetic. I kind of knew this, but I'd never had hands-on experience until recently. But some of the sheep were so used to getting a constant diet, or at least a constant exposure to grains, that they would refuse to eat the grasses that it turns out are the best for them overall in a general state when they're not pregnant or when they're not growing. This was a tough thing for me because, especially in this area, there's a lot of cow farmers, and there's a lot of cow hay that's grown up, which primarily is somewhere between 20 and 50% grass, and then the rest is alfalfa. And it turns out, just like with most animals, human beings included, especially Christians in this case, as I'm going to relate it here shortly, once they become, in this case, addicted to too many grains or too much alfalfa, they have a tendency of refusing to eat the things that are generally good for them because they've grown a taste for these things. And again, over this last 6 months, I've slowly been transitioning to more and more grasses because, again, I've come to find out I started to see the beginning signs of a little bit of the bloat and the bad attitudes and the aggressiveness that is caused by having too many calories too often. Now, obviously, when they're little, when they're pregnant, okay, different story. But in general, once they get past that incipient stage, they need to have a very specific diet that involves all the right nutrients. That includes vitamins and minerals. And if they have too much of the things that are not good for them, it will make them more and more tended to leave the things that they do need alone. And eventually, just like with humans, they would become, overweight, diabetic, sluggish, and they would start to pass on more and more genetic defects to their offspring. Why am I getting at this? Well, it came to mind to me the other day, now that I've slowly started to transition them over to what is good, away from what is bad. They're starting to adapt finally. It's been a slow process. There's been a lot of fighting. I've had to separate even female sheep from other female sheep because they would fight over the little bit of things that they were addicted to, because inherently, even though I've got more and more grass, I still have to feed them a little bit of alfalfa just because that's all there is. But there's also supplements I can give them to keep them from gaining too much calcium in their system. So all is going well in that regard. But I'm reminded when I watch them and I see their reactions to the negative side of things that they would consider to be the better side, the more delicious side. I'm reminded of Deuteronomy 8. I'm reminded of Deuteronomy 32, 35, and a bunch of other places in the Old Testament that basically warn believers of the realities behind having too much of what they want, too many good things, too many goods, too many delicious foods and whatnot, that would eventually create a certain amount of satiation or fullness, if you will, that would lead the Israelites eventually to come to a place to where they would want to reject their Lord out of comfort, because they're too comfortable. The reality is, as we're walking through this life, initially, when we read the Bible, we come to know the good things that come from salvation. We realize that we're in a fallen state, that we're sinful, that we need Jesus Christ. It's a sweet and glorious thing, very milk-like, very rich and awesome initial experience, because we realize once we have the Lord, we have this salvation. We can hold on to it now and then continue to hold on until the end, and then we know we're saved. The issue is once you get past that incipient stage, and Paul goes through this in his epistles, once we get past the point of needing spiritual milk, we need to move on to spiritual meat. Me personally, I love milk. I would much rather have a glass of milk than a steak, although I'm an adult and I've grown a taste for steak and I absolutely love it. If you put steak down in front of a child versus a bottle, I have 8 of them, and every single one of them would prefer that bottle up to a certain point. We as humans have the ability, just like sheep, to absolutely wreck our spiritual palates if we focus too much on what is spiritually sweet, if you will, at least in our perception. And we would get to a point to where we would reject, essentially moving on to the more solid, consistent, sustaining foods. That would be the bulk majority of the Bible, that eventually leads us into a position where we have to separate ourselves from sin, which is difficult, painful, and not tasty, if we're being honest. It leads us into testing, especially once we've put our foot down spiritually and decide that we want to be serious about this life. And we get to a place where, unfortunately, there are more mundane and more gray and more essentially boring days than there are good ones. And even to the point to where every day starts to have a bit of a negative tint, because the more and more Satan pounds on us, essentially, pounces, if you will, we get to a place where that initial desire for the sweet can tend to creep in, so much so that we could fall for something that could bring us back, that could cause a serious spiritual backsliding, or a nutritional reversion, if you will, spiritually speaking, back to the things that appeal to our palates only, the sweet things, all while ignoring the things that we actually need, that would sustain us, that would keep us healthy, vigorous, capable, let's say spiritually athletic, if you will. We're tended to, for lack of a better way to put it, fall for things that would drag us back. And that's a lot of the reason why, for example, here in the United States, our overtly incipient, babyhood, if you will, oriented church is so addicted to going back to feelings and emotionalism, and not overly embracing the growth that needs to occur, especially in this life, so as to be able to take the tests, and especially the test that is right around the corner. It's the reason why this channel is not grandiose. It's the reason why people who speak hard truths in love, in the Lord, are not popular. They're not cool. Websites like ichthys.com, ICHTHYS.com, in RTF word form, which are, very, very old school, if you will, just word format documents that are designed to be sat down, and if we compare it to the initial emotional reaction we had when we first came to believe, quite boring at times. Deep studies, valuable information that believers need, that spiritual meat Paul was talking about, so as to be able to get ready for whatever may come. In this case, for us, just right around the corner, the tribulation itself. And talking about this now, I'm reminded of the first generation of Israelites, who the mass majority, unfortunately the overwhelming mass majority, ended up becoming unbelievers, because eventually they couldn't grasp on to the testing that came from being in the desert. They couldn't stand, the paltry birds falling from the sky, giving them meat every day, basic, simple meat that wasn't probably all that tasty to them. They grumbled about the flavor of the manna, and the fact that, they came from a land of milk and honey back in Egypt. Spiritually speaking, the equivalent of being an unbeliever, let's be honest. That's basically what the Lord was always getting at. These people eventually decided that their tastes and their perceptions and their desires for that corn, that grain, that alfalfa that my sheep absolutely are addicted to, was somehow better than what the Lord had, all while ignoring the fact that he was trying to bring them into a place of maturity and strength so that they could handle what was coming, the establishment of God's special prize, his special people that would eventually birth all the prophets and eventually our Lord Jesus Christ. And had there not been, this was always in God's plan, so it's not like that it wasn't going to happen, but had they not had the few that would stay, the remnant that would remain his, Joshua, Caleb, and a few others, we wouldn't see the beautiful things that have come from the Lord's design, because there were always a few that were willing to do the thing that they needed, to eat the dry grass, to have the simple water, to have their nutrients and whatnot, to basically submit when the shepherd would come and grab that shepherd's crook and rope him around the neck and basically make them do the thing that they needed to do. So many resisted that they ended up falling away. And we live at a time now where, generally speaking, the overwhelming, unfortunately, mass majority of Christians have become so spiritually satiated with the false or the incipient or the weak that they're not ready for what's coming. So just like the sheep, just like proper shepherds, we should all be seeking out the spiritual meat, the dry grass, the simple water, so as to become that mature adult Christian that is ready for whatever this life throws at it, including the testing from Satan, that strengthens us to that point of being able to not only sustain ourselves in his spirit and in his word, but also be a benefit to the next generation. Obviously, sheep don't have the ability to shepherd themselves, but the picture is eventually, once the flock is brought through those incipient stages, slowly brought away, because it was a slow, drawn-out process. I'll be honest, there was no way I could have done a hard shift. They would have absolutely rejected that grass had I give them too much too quickly. But once they're brought to that place, the next generation that comes along won't fall for the same tricks of sweetness. Just like Revelation describes the book itself as being, the scroll, if you will, of Revelation as being sweet in the mouth and yet sour in the stomach, it is good to know what's coming, but it is difficult to experience once it actually comes around. And the only way we are able to do that as proper sheep to the ultimate shepherd, who is the Lord, is by accepting the dietary spiritual change that has to come along with everyday growth. So I urge you, be like good sheep. Don't resist the change that comes. Know that you have the most kind and the most aware shepherd that there could possibly be in the Lord. Understand that when difficult times come, when your taste is offended perhaps, when you are told difficult things that may shatter, unfortunately, whatever false belief you may hold, and in this case I'm directly referring to once saved, always saved, pre-tribulational rapture, the idea that, we're supposed to prosper no matter what. All of these things are of the world and of Satan, and they are a twisting of the words of God, specifically so as to offer you something that is sweet like honey, but in the end is only going to cause spiritual malaise, and if you let it take you over, eventual apostasy and abandonment of your salvation in the Lord, because you decided to deny him for the thing that tastes good. In this case, just the same as the Israelites in that first generation, they went back to Egypt in their hearts and therefore basically signed their own death warrant out in the desert. With what's coming, I would urge you all to continue on in growth. Take the lessons of the shepherd and the sheep to heart, and to not give up. Take your spiritual meat. Let me know what you guys think. This is something I've thought about for a long time. There is a very good reason why the Bible refers to these things in such a way, and we are all his flock, and we should all have the same state of mind when it comes to accepting the proper foods that we are need to be given, so as to come to that proper place of maturity and usefulness to the Lord. Comment down below, share with your friends. I pray you are all doing well and you're growing in the Lord, and I will talk to you soon.